In this tutorial, we're going to discuss a strategy that you can use to essentially run Alexia BASIC nonstop for weeks, possibly even months. Now, this has certainly been tested for upwards of 3 weeks with no issue whatsoever. So this works, but it may not necessarily be something you ever have to use, but this information can be very useful if you do choose to use Alexia BASIC in a manner that requires the program to be running for very long periods of time. So it really has less to do with the code itself, right? Any spell that you might put in the spell box, certainly you want to make sure that it is free of errors and that you have tested it thoroughly in a variety of different circumstances so that you can anticipate any potential issues that may arise. Because after all, if you want a particular spell to run for days, if not weeks, it's critical that the spell not run into any errors. Certainly, that's probably the biggest impediment to successfully running Alexia BASIC for long periods of time is simply having an unanticipated error in your spell. Now, that may not necessarily be a situation where there's anything syntactically wrong with the spell. However, you might, for example, visit a website that may have certain attributes that you didn't anticipate, and because of that, it could create a challenge with your spell. That being said, a couple of things to keep in mind. First and foremost, you're going to want to run Alexia BASIC on a dedicated computer, especially if you want to run Alexia BASIC for long periods of time. So let's just write that down as a dedicated computer system. Now, this can take on a couple different forms, right? So it could simply be a laptop that runs only Alexia BASIC. It can be a Windows server. I don't know why I put the word server in capital letters there. Okay, so it could be a Windows server. So for example, Windows Server 2008, 2012, etc. And of course, in that type of environment, Alexia BASIC would be running essentially in the cloud, right? So that would be another option. You can have perhaps an older Windows desktop computer that is used to run Alexia BASIC on a dedicated or in a dedicated manner. I mean, those are just 3 examples. So the reason why having a dedicated computer system makes so much sense is because if you're using for example, your main production laptop on which you are doing video editing, you're running Photoshop, you're browsing the web, you've got Excel open, you're working on a presentation in PowerPoint, and you've got all these different things going on, the likelihood of there being a system problem that requires a reboot is dramatically higher when you're just doing a bunch of other stuff on the system that at the same time is attempting to run a spell over days, if not weeks, or if not months. So a dedicated computer system really makes a lot of sense. And even before that, as we mentioned, we'll start with 0, making sure your spell is error-free. That's really important, right? Because if you have not taken the time to really test your spell to make sure that it's going to run smoothly, then there's a really good chance that you'll cast a spell, you'll walk away thinking, okay, great, it's going to just do its thing without my having to do anything else. And then lo and behold, because you didn't really do any error checking or really test it, you'll run into an error and then you'll come back and be very disappointed because you'll feel as if a lot of time was wasted with Alexia BASIC really doing nothing because, it ran into an error with your spell. So making sure your spell is error-free, making sure you're using a dedicated computer system, that's very important. And, if there were one other piece of advice that I could share insofar as really using Alexia BASIC over a long period of time, is to have a mechanism within your spell to really slow things down to a point where everything is being executed and cast in an orderly fashion. So that could perhaps best be described as use the sleep command generously. Okay, so is that spelled correctly? Yeah, it appears to be. So the reason why you want to use the sleep command generously is, for example, you may have a situation where you're visiting a particular website, and then the command immediately after visiting that website is to begin typing data into a web form on that website. Well, if there's any anomaly in your internet connection, right, while that spell is being cast, it can trip up the sequence of events, right? So if the actual website that you're trying to visit is not loaded because of some slowness with regard to your internet connection or a problem with the website, then you can very easily run into a situation where the spell gets ahead of itself and it begins to try to type things into a web form that's not even loaded, and then that's going to really throw the proverbial wrench into the spell and cause there to be a problem. Now, it's beyond the scope of this tutorial to get into a lot of detail as to how to create a spell that might, for example, check to make sure that a particular website that you're hoping to visit actually loads before typing anything into it. But there are ways to do that. Alexia BASIC gives you that flexibility. And so having a little bit of intelligence built into your spell to make sure that not only is it slow, making sure it's going slow enough to allow a website to load, but finally also making sure that whatever website you are visiting is actually there, right? Is actually loading before interacting with the site. And again, that's just by way of saying if you're attempting to extract data from a particular website and you have a spell that does that and it visits various sites, you want to make sure and build into your spell a little bit of intelligence just to ensure that before the spell continues, there's actually a site loaded. And if a site isn't loading, it can perhaps go into a loop where it goes to sleep for 5 minutes and then tries again. If it's still not loading, it goes to sleep for another 5 minutes and then it tries again. And then, of course, that provides the opportunity for a website that might be down to get put back online, or alternatively, if there's some sort of internet connectivity issue between the machine upon which you're running Alexia BASIC and the wider internet. Again, that type of intelligence built into your spell really allows for that internet connectivity issue to be resolved, and then once it's resolved, the Alexia BASIC spell that you're casting can continue operating. I mean, these are the types of things you need to think about when it's more than just, hey, I want to push a button and run a spell that's gonna, finish being cast within 30 seconds, but instead you're thinking, I want a spell that can be cast and continue to run for 30, 60, or 90 days, so on and so forth. So hopefully this tutorial at least gives you some ideas and perhaps provides you with a little bit of insight as to how you can really optimize Alexia BASIC to run for extended periods of time in a non-stop manner. Thanks for watching. Now please subscribe to our channel.